Picture this. It's 1916. You're one of the most famous women in America. You live in a Fifth Avenue mansion so grand it makes palaces look modest. You have a trust fund worth millions, the equivalent of over $1 billion today. Reporters follow your every move. Society watches your every breath. And you give it all up. Not because you were forced, not because you lost it, but because you fell in love, and one clause in a dead man's will said that love would cost you everything. This is the unbelievable true story of Madeleine Astor, the teenage bride of the richest man on the Titanic, the widow who survived the most famous shipwreck in history, and the woman who made a choice that stunned the world. Let's get into it. The scandalous marriage that shocked New York. Before we talk about the Titanic, before we talk about the fortune, we need to talk about the man. John Jacob Astor IV. In 1911, this man wasn't just rich. He was generationally, obscenely, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. The Astor family had been American royalty since the fur trade days. They owned massive chunks of Manhattan real estate, hotels, landmarks, entire city blocks. John Jacob Astor IV personally was worth an estimated $87 million in 1912 money. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere north of $2.4 billion today. Some historians put his real wealth even higher. He was, by many accounts, the single richest passenger to ever board the Titanic, and possibly one of the 5 richest men in the entire world at that time. He was also an inventor. He held patents. He wrote a science fiction novel. He built the famous Astoria Hotel in New York. Yes, as in the Waldorf Astoria, the man wasn't just inheriting money, he was a player. But here's where things get complicated. In 1909, at the age of 47, Astor divorced his first wife, Ava Lowell Willing. It was messy. It was public. New York high society was not pleased. Divorce in the early 1900s was already scandalous, but what came next was even worse. John Jacob Astor IV fell in love with a girl named Madeleine Talmadge Force. She was 18 years old. He was 47. She was a year younger than his own son, Vincent. Let that sink in. Now, was this unusual for the era? Among the ultra-wealthy, age gaps like this weren't unheard of, but combined with the fresh divorce, New York society was outraged. Churches refused to host the wedding. Newspapers ran scathing editorials. The social elite turned their backs. But Astor didn't care, or at least he didn't stop. On September 9, 1911, John Jacob Astor IV married Madeleine Force in a quiet ceremony at Beechwood, the Astor estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The bride wore a simple dress. Very few guests attended. The world's richest man had just married a teenager, and everyone had an opinion about it. To escape the gossip, the judgment, and the newspaper vultures, the newlyweds did what rich people did: they left the country. John and Madeleine embarked on an extended honeymoon through Europe and Egypt. They traveled in luxury. They visited Paris, London, Cairo. They sailed down the Nile. For a few months, they were just a couple, impossibly rich, yes, but away from the cruel whispers of Manhattan. And then Madeleine discovered she was pregnant. Astor wanted the baby born in the United States. It was time to go home. They needed a ship. They booked first-class passage on the finest, most modern, most unsinkable ocean liner in the world. RMS Titanic, the night everything changed. April 10, 1912, Southampton, England. John Jacob Astor IV and his young, pregnant wife Madeleine boarded the Titanic along with their entourage, a private nurse, a maid, a valet, and Astor's beloved Airedale terrier named Kitty. They were given some of the finest staterooms on the ship. First class on the Titanic was essentially a floating palace, and the Astors lived accordingly. Crystal chandeliers, multi-course dinners, promenades on the deck. The ship was everything it promised to be. For 4 days, anyway. April 14, 1912, 11:40 p.m. The Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Now we all know the broad strokes of what happened next. But let's zoom in on the Astors specifically, because what happened in the next 2 hours would define the rest of Madeleine's life. When the collision happened, most passengers didn't immediately panic. The ship was unsinkable, after all. John Jacob Astor reportedly cut open a life jacket to show Madeleine what was inside, almost casually, to calm her nerves, witnesses said. But as the situation grew dire, as the bow began to dip, as officers started loading women and children into lifeboats, the reality set in. Madeleine, 5 months pregnant, was helped into lifeboat number 4. John Jacob Astor asked the officer, reportedly Second Officer Charles Littler, if he could accompany his wife, given her delicate condition. Littler said no, women and children only. Accounts vary on exactly what Astor said next. Some say he asked which lifeboat number it was. Some say he simply stepped back, tipped his hat, and said nothing at all. Some witnesses said he lit a cigarette and watched the lifeboat lower. What we know for certain is this. John Jacob Astor IV did not get on a lifeboat. He went down with the Titanic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, in water so cold it killed most people within minutes. His body was recovered about a week later. In his pockets, they found $2,500 in cash and a gold pocket watch. The richest man on the ship died the same death as the poorest. And Madeleine, just 19 years old, 5 months pregnant, shivering in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic, was now a widow. The widow and the wills. Madeleine Astor arrived in New York aboard the rescue ship RMS Carpathia on April 18, 1912. She was met by a wall of reporters, photographers, and a public that was equal parts sympathetic and fascinated. The girl who had been shunned by society just months earlier was now the most famous widow in America. And she was about to become incredibly, almost absurdly wealthy with a catch. When John Jacob Astor IV's will was read, it revealed several key provisions for his young wife. A trust fund valued at approximately $5 million, again, in 1912 dollars, hundreds of millions today. The right to live in the Astor's magnificent Fifth Avenue mansion, one of the most valuable private residences in New York City. An annual income from the trust that would keep her living in extraordinary luxury for the rest of her life. Access to the Astor jewels, carriages, and estate properties. But there was one condition, one line in the will that would change everything. If Madeleine ever remarried, she would forfeit the entire trust fund, the mansion, the income, everything. It would all revert to Astor's son from his first marriage, Vincent Astor. Essentially, John Jacob Astor IV loved his young wife, but from beyond the grave, he made sure she would stay his wife, forever, at least on paper. This was not uncommon in wills of that era. Wealthy men frequently inserted remarriage clauses to protect family wealth and, frankly, to control their widows even in death. But the sheer scale of what Madeleine stood to lose made this clause extraordinary. She was 19 years old. She had her entire life ahead of her. And she had a choice, a lifetime of unimaginable wealth or the freedom to love again, the birth and the burden. On August 14, 1912, exactly 4 months after the Titanic sank, Madeleine gave birth to a son. She named him John Jacob Astor VI. The baby, known as Jakey, was born into instant fame. Newspapers called him the Titanic baby. He was, from his first breath, one of the wealthiest infants in American history. But for Madeleine, motherhood didn't ease the strange, suffocating reality of her life. She was rich, she was young, she was beautiful, and she was essentially trapped. Think about it, she was 19, living alone in a cavernous mansion that wasn't really hers. Society still hadn't fully accepted her. Many of the old money families viewed her as a gold digger, even in widowhood. She had no real career, no independence, no identity outside of being Mrs. Astor. And she couldn't date, couldn't remarry, couldn't fall in love, not without losing everything. For 4 years, Madeleine lived inside this gilded cage. She raised her son. She attended social events. She managed her household. She was, by all outward appearances, living the dream. But behind the curtains of that Fifth Avenue mansion, she was lonely. And then she met someone. The man who changed everything. His name was William Carl Dick. He wasn't a stranger. He was a childhood friend, someone from Madeleine's world, someone she had known long before the name Astor ever entered her life. He came from a respectable family, had moderate wealth, and was by all accounts a decent, kind man. But he was not John Jacob Astor IV. He was not one of the richest men on earth. He couldn't offer mansions and trust funds and a name that opened every door in America. What he could offer was companionship, warmth, normalcy, love. And for Madeleine, who had survived the Titanic at 19, who had been widowed before she could legally drink, who had spent 4 years rattling around a mansion built by a dead man's money, that was enough. More than enough. She made her decision. The day she walked away. On June 22, 1916, Madeleine Astor married William Carl Dick in a quiet ceremony. And just like that, it was gone. The trust fund, the mansion, the income, the Astor name, the jewels, the carriages, the life that millions of people would have done anything to keep. Gone. She reportedly received a lump settlement of around $1.7 million, a fraction of what the trust would have been worth over her lifetime. She gave back the Fifth Avenue mansion. She handed the keys to Vincent Astor and walked out. The press went absolutely insane. Headlines screamed about the fortune she had abandoned. Columnists debated whether she was brave or foolish. Society matrons clucked their tongues. Armchair philosophers weighed in from every corner. The Titanic widow gives up millions for love. It was the biggest gossip story of 1916, and this was during World War I. But Madeleine didn't do interviews. She didn't explain herself. She simply married the man she loved and moved on. What happened after now? Here's where the story gets complicated. Because life isn't a fairy tale, and walking away from $1 billion fortune doesn't guarantee a happy ending. Madeleine and William Carl Dick had 2 sons together, William Carl Dick Jr. and Trevor Dick. For a while, by most accounts, they were happy. They lived comfortably, though not lavishly. They had a good life. But the marriage eventually unraveled. In 1933, Madeleine and William Carl Dick divorced. And then, almost immediately, she made another surprising move. She married again, this time to an Italian professional boxer and sometime actor named Enzo Fiamont. This marriage was not well received. Fiamont was widely viewed as a fortune hunter, despite the fact that Madeleine no longer had much of a fortune to hunt. The marriage was rocky from the start. There were reports of arguments, instability, and deep unhappiness. They divorced in 1938. After that, Madeleine retreated from public life. She lived quietly. She stayed in New York, but she was no longer the dazzling young socialite or the famous Titanic widow. She was just a woman, older, quieter, and largely forgotten by the society that once couldn't stop talking about her. On March 27, 1940, Madeleine Astor IV Dick Fairmont died at her home in Palm Beach, Florida. She was 46 years old. The cause of death was listed as a heart ailment. She outlived the Titanic by only 28 years. Legacy, was it worth it? And this is the question that haunts this story, isn't it? Was it worth it? She gave up one of the largest personal fortunes in American history. She walked away from the Astor name. She traded a mansion for a modest home, a dynasty for a divorce, a legacy for love. And that love, it didn't last, at least not the first time. Some people look at Madeleine's story and see tragedy. A naive young woman manipulated by wealth, then destroyed by its absence. A girl who was in over her head from the moment she married a 47-year-old tycoon at 18 and who spent the rest of her life paying for it. But other people, and I think this is the more interesting reading, see something else entirely. They see a woman who refused to be owned. Think about it. In 1912, she was essentially the property of the Astor estate. A dead man's will dictated how she could live, who she could love, what she could do with her own life. She was a prisoner in a mansion, a bird in a golden cage, a trophy on a shelf. And she said no. She said, "I would rather be free and poor than rich and controlled." She said, "My heart is not for sale." She said, "You can keep the mansion." In an era when women couldn't even vote yet, the 19th Amendment wasn't ratified until 1920. Madeleine Astor made one of the most radical declarations of personal freedom imaginable. She chose herself. And sure, her life after that wasn't perfect. Whose is? She made mistakes. She married the wrong man the third time. She died young, but she died on her own terms. She was never anyone's widow again, the forgotten woman of the Titanic. When people talk about the Titanic, they talk about the ship, the iceberg, the band playing as the stern rose into the sky. They talk about Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews and the 1,500 souls who went into the water. Sometimes they talk about John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on board, who died like a gentleman and left behind a fortune. But almost no one talks about the 19-year-old girl in lifeboat number 4. The girl who was pregnant, the girl who was terrified, the girl who watched the largest ship in the world disappear beneath the Atlantic and then had to figure out how to live with what came after. The girl who was handed the keys to a kingdom and gave them back. Madeleine Astor deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as a scandal, not as the wife of, but as a woman who, in her own quiet way, did something that most of us never have the courage to do. She chose love over money. And whether you think that was the bravest thing in the world or the most foolish, well, that probably says more about you than it does about her. If this story hit you, drop a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because history is full of stories like this, stories they never taught you in school. Until next time.